Hey there, my name is Jamie Stewart, and I am a kite flyer and a kite builder here in Erie, Pennsylvania. And I'm going to make a video here that explains how to make one of my favorite kites, which is actually not one kite, but a lot of kites, and that is a kite arch. Now, I'm making this video for a couple reasons, but number one is so I actually don't forget how to make it myself, but number two, in hopes that you will actually find this helpful on how to make one from start to finish. It's really not a hard project to do. Course of a couple weekends, you should be able to complete this, and you can scale it. So if you want to make 10 kites, 20 kites, or 200, you can do as many as you want. So this is really a pretty straightforward project. And on top of that, it's, really rinse and repeat, right? So you make one or you make 1,000 of them, they're all the same. So because of that, we're in my shop here in the basement, and I have a couple things that are going to make my life a little bit easier. Number one, I have a nice little table here with a glass top so we can use a technique called hot cutting. And hot cutting is where we actually melt the material that we're using. I have a standard sewing machine. I'm using some sailmaker's thread, and other than that, it's pretty basic and straightforward. And I'll go through a couple of the techniques that we're going to use as we do this. But for my project, I've decided that I'm going to make it out of 4 different colors, and I'm actually using polyester, which is a little bit lighter and a little bit stiffer than standard ripstop nylon. So my kite arch is going to be a little bit lighter because of that. I'll go through more of the techniques in here as we move forward. But first of all, just know that this is a fun, exciting, and easy project to do. And on top of that, it's definitely something that any person, beginner, any skill level, beginner or expert, can do. And it makes a huge show on the beach or at your local kite field. So look forward to working through with this project with you. It's going to be, for me, over the course of a couple weeks until we finish it. But for you, it'll be one video. So I'm going to go through as much of my technique, as much of my detail as possible, and look forward to showing you the finished product at the end. The first thing that we're going to need to do is make a pattern. And this is a standard diamond kite. And the dimensions of this are 16 inches wide by 16 inches tall. I cut this up on some masonite, and masonite is a hard board. The reason why I like that is because it stands up better to the test of time, so I can make this over and over again in the future. And on top of that, it's really inexpensive to buy. You can get it in 4x8 sheets or smaller, and at the same time, it's easy to shape and manipulate. Just a jigsaw will cut it out. So this kite, I can lay it right on my glass, and I can put it on top of my material with a little bit of weight, and I can hot cut right around the edge of it. Once I lay out my material, here I have a large roll of the Icarus polyester. I take it and I line it up straight on one side of my table, and then I also line up my ruler across it here, so that way I can make one cut all the way across this, and it will be perfectly straight, it will be perfectly square, and give me a nice clean line to start with. Just gonna wait for my hot cutter. In this case, I'm just using my Craftsman soldering gun. This is from probably 25 years ago. And I just have the kind of a spade tip on it, and I have it filed down a little bit, but just let it warm up. And then all you need to do is just run it down the straight line nice and slow. Now that I have my material cut and nice and square, I've lined up my pattern on here also nice and square, because I want my ripstop lines to be running straight and perpendicular. I don't want them to be crooked or on a bias in any way, shape, or form. So I lined up my material, I lined up my pattern, I put a little bit of weight on it, and we're gonna go ahead and hot cut this. Now, one thing that we're gonna wanna be extra special careful of are any of the corners, because we're gonna be lining these up next to each other and nesting them. So you don't want to overshoot the corners too much, otherwise you might cut into your next kite. I found this way to be the most efficient in terms of the material. I also noticed I put the tip closest to me, so that way, and I left a little bit of space here, so that way as I nest these moving down, I have a little bit of room. I also left a little bit of room off to the other side here as well. Now, I can come ahead and I'm going to flip this over. Let me move the camera a little bit. So I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to line it up with the kite that I just cut. So literally it's just flip-flopping all the way down the line. Once I get this lined up reasonably correct, put a little bit of weight on it, and I'm only going to need to cut 3 sides now. Just making sure I got all the corners. And gently take this off. I'm going to line it back up. And I'm going to keep cutting. I'm going to do this all the way down the line. As you can see, you don't need any kind of special hot cutter. Any type of soldering iron that heats up will do the job. Even if you file down the edge a little bit, that'll help even more. You do want to pay special attention to your actual soldering iron and make sure that you're not overusing it in its duty cycle. And you'll see I should be able to fit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them right on here. Now that you get everything cut, it's just as simple as gently removing these from the table. You want to be careful with when you're pulling and how you're pulling it, because you don't want to rip any corners that may have not completely cut. And if there's just a little bit, sometimes you can just give it a little pull and it'll come right out. And then we'll take our material, we'll free it from the table, and we'll pull it down and we'll start nesting again and getting some more cut. So we'll just line up our kite, just like that, make it nice and even on this one line right here, and then we'll go ahead and start cutting some more. I'm not going to bore you with all of this. We're going to just run through it and we'll cut as many as we can. All right, now that we've gotten all of the kites cut, now it's time to cut the tails. I need to cut 3 tails per kite that are about 1 inch. I go a little bit wider than 1 inch, and I'll show you why, by 16 inches. So whatever the width and length of your diamond kite is, that's the length of your tails. So I'm gonna make mine 16 inches. And in order to do that, I actually start by cutting the entire width of the material. Okay, now that I have my straight line cut, I left it attached to the glass, and I have myself just a 36-inch ruler. It's just slightly wider than 1 inch, and all I do is just line it up with my straight cut edge. I pull it down here, and I'm going to weigh this down, and I'm going to go ahead and cut the entire length. And I'm going to do this. Basically, you can get 1 kite per width of material. So I'm making 30 kites, so I need to do this 30 times, and you just rock and roll through it, and next thing you know, you're done. Go ahead and put this off to the side. I'm going to move my weights. Again, leaving it connected, I'm going to take my ruler and I'm just going to square this up the width of the ruler. Weight it back down. And go ahead and cut again. And we're just going to do this over and over and over again. And while I do the rest of this, I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead to actually cutting the tails to length. But the magic of editing will be done cutting the tails. All right, now that we have all of the long tails cut, right, we got to go through and actually cut them to size. And I have a little system in order to make this work, a little bit easier for me. I actually pre-measure out 16 inches. So that way all I have to do is line up the tail at the kind of the edge of my table and then just go ahead and make a cut, right, with my my hot knife. And that way every tail matches up and I can easily quickly kind of go through this. So let me show you kind of how this system looks. So the way I actually do this is I have a long straight edge that's right on the front of my table, and I have it lined up right on the edge of my glass. And then what I do is I come over here and I put another ruler straight edge right on the 16-inch mark, right on that 16-inch mark, and I square it off as much as possible. Then all I have to do is take my long tail, come over here and pull it right to the edge, just like that. And I can come over here and just hot cut this. That gives me a 16-inch tail, and I can get 3 tails 16 inches out of one long piece. It gives me a little bit extra, and I'll actually show you what we do with some of that extra as well. So I'm gonna go ahead and get all of these cut, and I put them in stacks. You can see I have my 16-inch tails and the extra pieces. I just put them all in nice stacks so they're ready to go. The next step that I'm going to be doing is actually taking and hot tacking all of my tails together. In the next couple of steps, we're gonna hot tack the tails. We're gonna mark the tails for the length, and then also mark the kites. So I'll show you all of this so that we're ready to go for the actual sewing steps coming up. So let's get into actually hot tacking the tails together and how I do that. And for those of you who don't know what hot tacking is, it's when you take I use just a pencil tip soldering gun or soldering iron, and I just tap the fabric, and it puts a really small melt hole in it, and it holds the material together long enough so that way you can sew it. So let's actually get into hot tacking the tails together. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab 3 tails. I'm going to line them up nice and neat. I'm going to take my soldering iron, and the secret to this is just holding it still, giving it a quick little tap, and holding it just for an extra second afterwards, so that way the material has time to set. You want everything to be nice and flat, because without it being nice and flat, it's not going to properly hot tack. That's all there is to it. So we're going to go ahead and do a couple and set them off to the side. You can see the foreman's over here. Let's say hi to the foreman. That's the foreman. So we line everything up without burning your finger.
Burn your finger!
Give it a little hot tap. That's all there is to it. Set them off to the side. Make sure you remember which end is the hot tacked one, because we'll obviously have to sew those onto the kite. So I'm going to go ahead and hot tack all of these, and we'll be back to you here once we're all done hot tacking. Okay, now that we have everything hot tacked for our tails, I actually take one more step with the tails and the kites, and that's marking everything. She's just a mechanical pencil. If you have disappearing ink and you want to use that, go right ahead. But what I want to do is actually mark 1.5 inches from where I hot cut on the tails down from the top. So this is where I hot tacked. And I'm going to mark 1.5 inches down, and that's where the bottom of the kite's going to be. And also, while I'm marking that, I'm going to go ahead and mark the cross section of the kite. from edge to edge. And I'm going to mark that so I know later down the line where I'm sewing the line onto it. So taking a couple minutes now will make our life a lot easier and more consistent as we go down the line. I'm going to show you how I mark these with a straight edge and for the kites, and also just a little tick mark for the tails. You're never going to see them when they're up in the air, so that's why I just use a number 2 pencil. Let's dive into it. All right, so with my straight edge, I'm going to just take the end. This is the end that I hot tacked together. So I have 3 layers of tails hot tacked. Now, all of my tails kind of have a cup like this, right? Kind of in like this. And I hot tacked all of them the same. And I'm actually going to flip it over because all of my tails are going to be the same orientation. So that way, if there's any different shine on the material, it all looks the same. So I'm just going to come in here, and I'm just going to put a little mark right in the middle in 1.5 inches. And again, put that off to the side. One of the biggest things, too, when you're making this many of something is efficiency. So you want to be as efficient as possible and think through your steps ahead of time. So I'm going to leave it with the marks facing up when I make my pile of tails. My next step is going to be to hot tack all of the tails to the actual kites and then sew those on. So, and I want to do that in the proper orientation. So if you do everything as efficiently as possible, you're going to save yourself a lot of time over the course of, as many kites as you're making. So go ahead and mark all your tails at 1.5 inches. And once you're done with that, I'm going to show you how we're going to mark all of the kites. Okay, now that I'm finished with all of my tails, marking my tails in 1.5 inches, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to start marking my kites. And let's see if I can maybe zoom out a little bit here for you. And all I'm going to do is just come in here and I'm just going to line up corner to corner with my straight edge. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect, but we want it to be pretty close. And start at the middle and just give a line across it. And it's going to be faint. You probably won't be able to see it on camera here, but I do have the line. So I'm just going to go through and mark every one of my kites. Again, a little bit of thinking ahead here makes our life a heck of a lot easier once we actually get into the sewing of these kites down to the kite line, to the flying line. Again, I was paying special attention to keeping all of my kites with the same surface up all the time, just so that way, again, that's why I start in the middle here and work my way out, is I don't snag the kite. So keeping the kite surface, the same surface up all the time, make sure that any different texture or sheen that's visible on the kites once it's in the air are all the same, because we want them to all look the same. I think it'll look better that way. As you can see, the foreman's back, making sure I'm on task, doing my job here. Am I doing good, foreman? Yeah? Okay. So the next step is actually when we get to assemble some
Burn
kites.
yourself, kids.
So the next steps for me is actually one of my favorite parts, which is actually assembling the tails to the kite. Really starts to look like a diamond kite, and you can kind of see your work come to fruition. All right, so I'm going to take my kite. The side that I marked is down. I'm going to take my tails. The side that I marked is up on the tails. And here's my mark. I have my mark right here. So I'm going to come in and I'm just going to make sure that the bottom of the tip of the kite lines up to my mark. But I'm just going to hold this here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to put 4 little hot tacks. Again, just hit it. Leave your finger there for a half a second just till everything cools off. And that's all there is to it. And at this point now, the kite is ready to go for sewing. So I'm just going to move it off to the side, again, very gently, as to not pull that hot tack off. So again, kite, line it up straight, hit my mark, hot tack, 4 little hot tacks, and we're off to the races. Oh, foreman's back. All right, I'm going to go ahead and hot tack some of these and on to the next step.
Burn yourself, kids.
Yeah, good point, Jacob. You want to be very careful with that soldering iron. You don't want to burn yourself. Now that we have all the tails hot tacked to the kites, now it's time to sew the tails to the kites and also make a spar pocket. Now we have 3 layers of tails and 1 layer of kites. So that gives us 4 total layers of material. And my goal is to be able to get that spar in the middle of those. So that way it gives us the most protection from the spar poking through. I'm also going to show you how I sew this kind of in of a V pattern. So that way it gives me a little bit of room to get the spar in and also keep it in its position while maintaining a lot of sewing contact, so to say. A lot of times in kite making, we use a 3-step zigzag. And for this, I'm actually using just a standard zigzag. And it gives me a lot of stitches for the small amount of space that I have to sew these. So let's take a peek. I'm actually going to use a different color kite. Oh, the foreman's back. I'm going to use a different color kite so that way you can see what the stitches look like. And I'll show you how I go about doing these stitches. Oh, the foreman's over there now. All right, let's take a peek. Okay, so you can see here on this different color fabric, it's a little bit easier to see. But you see how I sew like a little bit of a V into it? Let me rotate it around a little bit here so you can see a little bit better. And you can see it's just a standard zigzag here. I come down straight, I kind of go down to the bottom, and I curve back up and go across the top or on the side. And this is all done in one step and a little lock stitch at the beginning and the end, and you're good to go. Okay, so the sewing machine I'm going to use is nothing fancy. It's just a Walmart sewing machine. The one I have is a Brother, and it is a computerized one, so it gives me a little bit more stitches, a little bit more accurate stitches. But at the same time, any real sewing machine will work. As long as you have straight stitch, zigzag, 3-step zigzag are the kind of the most popular ones that we use in kite making. Now, also, I'm using a Sailmaker's thread, and this is a UV stabilized thread, so it doesn't degrade with UV light, considering these kites will live outside. It's a little bit thicker than your standard thread as well, and a little bit stronger. So I prefer to use a Sailmaker's thread for that reason. And other than that, nothing else is fancy here. All right, and my sewing machine, I have it set to number 4, which is my straight zigzag. And then also here I have the stitch length at 1.4, and I have the actual zigzag width at 3.0. My tension is at 6. You can see I have my my thread coming up and down and in, and we're gonna be off sewing. And I usually sew these on the side that I marked. So here's my mark. I'm going to sew that with that mark up. I come in here and I'm just going to do a little lock stitch. Sew down, angle, angle, and then sew up. Finish it off, cutting the threads. And you can see, finish spar pocket. Okay, now that we got the kites sewn together with their tails, this is kind of the most complicated part, which is this top spar pocket. It does require a little bit of cutting and a little bit of hot tacking, and it's a small piece. So we're actually going to take a piece, I'm going to put a graphic up, and we're going to spread it out, and we're going to fold it a couple times, actually 2 times. So again, just like the tails, we have 4 layers of material. So I'm going to go ahead and actually demonstrate this so you can see it. But basically, all those extra pieces of tails that we cut off, we're going to use those to make our spar pockets for the top. Let's go right into it. Okay, for this, I actually take my ruler on my bench and I'm going to mark out, believe it or not, it's 11/16. It's not quite at 3/4 of an inch. I find that it's just the little bit smaller and it works a little better for it. And all I'm going to do is take and fold it over this way. I'm going to hold it on my mark and then pull back on this side until I get to the right dimensions. And then polyester is very much like paper. You can just crease it. I'm going to take the entire thing. You can see I have my little flap. And I'm going to flip it up and flip it upside down. And now I'm going to fold it back again on itself. This time, I'm going to match it up with itself. Okay, creasing it. Now I have something that looks like this. When I fold it together like this, I'm going to take, and this is the only part that I don't hot cut, I'm going to cut it a little bit long, maybe just like 1/8 of an inch long. And now what that has done is given me a little bit of material here that I can set my spar on top of and slide it in when this is all sewn together. Now that I have this cut, all I need to do is hot tack it. All right, now it comes time to hot tack. So I'm going to take, and this is kind of a little bit fiddly, but I'm going to hot tack all 4 corners, paying close attention to keeping my hot tacks close to the edge. And then again, letting it sit for a second. So you can see, here we go. You can see I have 4 hot tucks on there. Oh, the foreman's back. Okay. So I'm going to go through and just hot tack all of those. But now that I have these hot tacked together, I'm going to show you my next step is each one of these that I just cut together equals 2 spar pockets. So I'm going to cut them in half lengthwise. Now that I have them cut lengthwise, come back in here and do another hot tack. And here we go. Finished top the kite spar pocket. Now that we have all of our top spar pockets cut and hot tacked, I have a pile of them here, we're going to go ahead and we're going to hot tack those to the kites, and then we'll sew those. So I'm going to show you that process now. Okay, it's pretty simple. We're just going to take our spar pocket, and you'll notice that this one I have a little bit of a flap on it down here, and that's where I'm going to use to put my spar on to slip it into the pocket. So this is going to get attached just with 4 straight little hot tacks. Just kind of get it in position. And where I already have my hot tacks, I'm just going to gently touch. So you can see right at the top is where I have my spar pocket now. So we'll do a couple more. We'll go ahead and keep doing this until we're completely done, and I'll check back in here and show you how to sew them. Okay, now that we have all of our spar pockets tacked, we're going to sew the top pocket on here. And it's actually pretty easy. All we need to do is we're going to start upside down. And we're going to just sew up the side. I always start kind of on that lead air where I have, and I'm going to keep this really tight to the edge. I'm going to sew up, lock stitch. I'm just going to lift my presser foot, or lift the needle out of there. And And I'm going to just take this and flip it around. And I'm going to move it over. Get a little bit of slack in the thread. I'm just going to move it over to the other side. And I'm going to stitch down. Go ahead and take that off and cut the extra off. And that's all there is to it. We'll do a couple more. Okay, now I've gotten all of the kites sewn, so all the tails are sewn on, all the spar pockets are sewn on, and every kite is marked. So we're basically, in essence, done with all of the individual kites, with the exception of one thing. We need to go ahead and we need to mark the center, because the idea is we don't want to have the spar outside of the line. We want it sandwiched between the connecting line and the kite itself. It makes it a lot easier to grab it and pull it back in or let them out. So I 3D printed a little measure stick that allows me to mark 1 inch at right the middle of each one of the kites. And I'm gonna go ahead and show you how I do that now, and then we'll go ahead and mark all of the kites, and then we'll start sewing. So I went ahead and printed this little measure stick, and it has the same profile as the edge of the kite, and it gives me 2 marks, which are right in the center. So all I need to do is just kind of line it up here on the edge and also over here, and give a little mark on either side of the line. And that'll allow me to sew the line up to that mark. I'm gonna skip that area and sew along the rest of it. So I'm gonna go ahead and do the rest of these. It's now time for the most exciting part, which is really sewing the kites to the line. So what I've done is I've chosen to use Spectra as my kite line, and the reason why I'm doing that is because it's light and strong. And the kite line I'm using is 350-pound test Spectra that I love this. It's a little bit thicker. It's easier to sew because we're actually going to be sewing right down the middle of this line. So you don't want to do something that's too thin because it's going to be really hard to sew. Now, to make it easier to sew, I've actually 3D printed a adapter for my presser foot that has a little bit of groove and that feeds the line right down. So really it's as easy as lining up the kite, putting the line through, doing a little bit of lock stitch, sewing to your first mark, lock stitch it, just release the presser foot, push the kite back a little bit farther to your next mark, lock stitch down the end of the kite and another lock stitch, and feeding the line right down through it is kind of the most important part. Now, before I actually get started, I have a significant kite arch, so 330-pound test is going to be more than adequate for what this is. If you link these together with other arches from other kite flying friends, you're going to want something that has at least enough, tensile strength in order to make a really big arch. So I never want to be the weakest link and have a big arch blow apart because of my kite arch. Now, the other thing that I'll do is I'll start with just making a loop on one of these ends, and that way I have something to tie off to. And I'm going to keep that pretty tight to the kite arch when I sew it on. The reason why I'm doing that is that I can make leads to make the kite arch, 10, 15, 20 feet, whatever I want off the ground. So I'm going to start with a loop at the end, and I'm just going to start feeding my kites through it. The pattern is totally up to you. I've chosen a pattern that I feel is right for me, but it just depends on how many kites you have and the pattern you want to make with the different designs. So this is really the kind of the fun part. Why don't I start by showing you the adapter that I made for my presser foot. It's very simple, has a groove down the middle, a little opening for where the needle goes through, and a little tiny slit for me to get some thread through if I want to as well. Let's take a peek. Okay, here's my presser foot. and I've taken it off the sewing machine, and I've designed and 3D printed this adapter plate. So you can see on the adapter there's a groove that goes right down the middle of it, and that's where the line's going to go. I made a little opening here, and that's going to be for where the needle goes through, and you'll notice that from where my thumbnail is up to the top here, it's a very small opening. The smaller that is, the better, because you don't want the line to wobble through there. Okay, and as you can see here, I have the presser foot installed, and this is the kite line, and it's going right through, and I have it set up so it does slide, but it does keep it nice in line with the needle. Okay, I've started my sewing. As you can see, I have my loop on the end here. The kite has a lock stitch at the end, and now I'm literally just going to sew right down this line. I don't know if you can see the line here, but this is our pencil line from before. I'm just going to line up the kite line over top of it, and I'm going to sew until I hit my first mark. My first mark is right about here, and I have a pencil mark. And there's no racing this, nice and slow. Get the nice kite line. This is going to be what everyone looks at whenever it's in the air. So I'm just going to take it nice and slow. Coming up to my lock stitch. I'm going to go back a couple. Okay, now I've got my first mark. I get the kite tails out of the way. All I'm going to do is just lift the presser foot, and I'm just going to pull a little bit, so that way everything goes with it, including the thread. A little extra thread on there isn't going to hurt anything. Make sure the kite line is lined back up, and I'm on my other mark with my needle lined up, which I do see. And now I'm going to start sewing again. But first, lock stitch it a couple times. Make sure it's all straight. And trying to keep everything on the line. Okay, before I get to the end now, I'm gonna leave a little bit of extra line for myself. I'm actually just gonna continue to sew right down this kite line because I'm going to butt my kites right up against each other. So I don't need a lot of gap in here. I'm probably gonna leave about a finger width in between, just a little bit of room. So instead of me actually cutting and, you know, the thread and stopping and everything, I'm just gonna sew right down the line a little bit. So now I'm gonna get another kite ready. The biggest issue with this is you want to make sure that all of your pockets are up, right? If you sew one of the kites upside down, now you're gonna have a random kite with a spar pocket in the wrong place. So I made sure my pile next to my kite, or my sewing machine, all of the pockets are up, and I'm gonna sew with all of the pockets up, okay? So I'm just gonna come through here, and I'm just gonna keep sewing. And again, I do want to put a lock stitch in here. So I'm going to put a lock stitch in here before I go to the end. Okay, now, if I'm looking at the needle, it's hard for you to see, but the needle is basically right at the end of the kite. So I'm going to come through and I'm going to line up my next kite here. And kind of get this where I want it. And I'm just going to sew through this a little bit. Okay, I got the next kite. I'm gonna come back and put a lock stitch on it. Give myself a little extra line. And I'm gonna keep sewing. Okay, now that I'm into the next kite, let's take a little peek. Things look great. So I think now we just have to do that until I'm done sewing, which will be a while. So that's the thing about a kite arch, is it's not really hard. It's a lot of the same things over and over and over again. And that's all it is. So right now, again, I'm keeping my line, and I might actually just do a little bit of this to keep the line centered, or the kite mark, or the line on the kite mark where I need it to be too. Okay, so again, I'm coming up to my next mark. I'm gonna put a couple lock stitches in. Okay, now I'm ready to go. I'm gonna move the tails out of the way, pull my presser foot up, get to my next mark, make sure the line is lined up in my groove. I'm right on my mark. Put a couple lock stitches in. Now I'm a little bit off my mark, so I'm just going to kind of move a little bit here. There we go. Again, I'm getting ready to come up to another lock stitch. Okay, now again, right at the end, so I'm going to take my next kite. Gonna make sure my spar pockets are facing up underneath the kite line. Kind of get it fed into here where it needs to be. Okay, and we're gonna just start sewing. Now the other thing too, I didn't mention, but I have my sewing machine set so that the needle stops up. So that way it makes it a little bit easier for me to do this procedure here, where I'm just kind of pulling a little bit, getting it lined up. Okay, I'm a little bit off the mark, but that's okay. I'm not too concerned as long as I'm sewing on the line up to the edge of the kite. And I'm actually going to pull on this line a little bit to help with the lock stitch. Okay, and that's it. We just keep going. So I'll finish this up and I'll check back in with you here once I have the entire kite arch sewn together. We've now completed sewing all the kites to the line, and that's the biggest work that you'll have to do sewing. So we are now done sewing. The next thing I'd like to do is I did leave just a little loop at the end of each side of the kite train or the kite arch, and then I just made like another 6-foot lead just so that way I can attach this to an anchor and the kite's not just dragging on the ground. So I find about 6 foot is about right. You can go a little bit longer if you want to make it a little bit longer, but my kite arch is absolutely long enough now. So the next step is we just have to finalize the kites, and that involves putting a dowel in it, right, or some type of spar. So for now, I'm just using just 1/8-inch wood spars that I got at my big box store. I'm going to be upgrading to a carbon, probably a little bit thinner than 1/8 inch, make it a little bit lighter, a little bit stiffer at the same time, and it'll just slip right in. But I'm finding that it's easy just to take and cut these to about 15 inches, maybe a little bit more, a little bit less. You don't want them to be too tight. You want them to have a little bit of wiggle in there. But I'm finding about 15, and then you can slip these in and then bend them in there pretty easily. So I'll go ahead and show you how we're gonna do this. And then at that point, all we need to do is really just make some anchor bags if you're flying on the beach, or stake it down if you're staking it on a field. And I'd highly recommend making a box too. And when I say a box, something that you can take and put around your neck and have the box hang in front of you, and then you can just pull the kite arch right in. So we'll get into that in a little bit too, but let's take a peek at how we put these spars in. Okay, so the reason why we marked that about 3/4 of an inch or 1 inch is I want to take and put this spar underneath of it, so it's captured. And then we'll be able to slip this end in. Now remember, we left a little bit of wear in here at the bottom of that pocket, so we can just easily slip it in. Now the bottom part's a little bit tricky. I want to move around because I'm right-handed. But I take this and I kind of bend it a little bit with my thumb, and I try to get it into the middle of the, so there's 3 tails that we sewed together. I want 2 on the top, 1, and then my kite material itself. And that's all there is to it. So now we gotta just go ahead and put all of our spars in. Now at this point, I also like to keep things rather organized, because if you start making a lot of twists in here, it's only gonna show up later on down the line where you'll have twists in between kites, and we don't wanna do that. So now's the time to keep it organized. I added my, my extra line onto the end, and I'm gonna put it in a box, and we're gonna hopefully fly it here momentarily.